How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. Policies have seen a much needed overhaul in the recent 1.26 patch. Policies also have been one of the most underutilized mechanic in game, and I'm glad to see PDS agrees on that. The new patch and Dharma DLC has improved policy UI, along with introducing or changing some policies. Now you can select up to 3 policies per monarch point category, which means you can have 9 active policies at a time rather than 5. And you can get some extra policies from government reforms as well. You also get the first policy from each category for free, costing no monarch points. So this is definitely a significant change in policies mechanic, and hopefully it will be used a little bit more. Let's take a quick look at which policies have changed, and was it a nerf or a buff, and if these policy changes has made any idea group more appealing. Let's start by looking at some of the administrative policies that changed in the 1.26 patch. These are the policies that cost admin points. The innovative espionage policy, which was 20% spy defense and plus 10% spy strength, is now minus 25% stab cost and plus 1 diplomat. The espionage idea group isn't used frequently, and I don't see this policy changing that either, although the new policy is better than what it was with the extra diplomat, but it's still a policy that's not going to be used widely. The religious defensive policy, it was minus 1 unrest and plus 20% religious unity. Now it's minus 1 unrest and plus 1 attrition. This one is definitely a nerf, as 20% religious unity was pretty useful late game, especially if you don't take humanist ideas. Although when you think about it, a religious idea group shouldn't give you more tolerance, so it kinda makes sense in a roleplay scenario. The minus 1 unrest is definitely great, and the plus 1 attrition will be a nice deterrent to enemies. Next is religious plutocratic policy. It was plus 2 tolerance of heretics, and now it's tolerance plus the minus 50% fort maintenance on rival border. So this is definitely buffed, although it's still not strong enough as the rival border is very situational. The economic aristocratic policy, which was 10% tax and 0.5% yearly legitimacy, devotion or horde unity, now is 10% tax and minus 10% cavalry cost. So this is definitely a buff for cavalry-centric nations such as Poland. If you're focusing on early cavalry advantage, you tend to pick aristocratic ideas first anyways, and cavs are expensive, so economic idea group goes well with it. This policy is definitely more useful now. The economic diplomatic policy was 10% tax and minus 0.05 autonomy change. Now it has been up to 15% tax. Also, this policy changed from diplo group to admin group. So on one hand, it is definitely buffed with the extra 5% tax, but now it uses admin points, which are usually more valuable than diplo points. Although if you aren't looking to take a lot of provinces for yourself, this policy might work pretty well. The monthly autonomy change will definitely help with faster government reforms. The economic trade policy is the same, but this too changed from diplo to admin points, which would be considered a nerf again, but if you're taking both economic and trade, you're likely not going full expansionist, so this might see little more use. Expansion offensive policy changed from plus 10% spy strength and minus 10% AE to auto explorer adjacent to colony. The 10% AE modifier was great, but if you have expansion ideas, you're obviously playing a colonization game, and the ability to see the adjacent provinces to your colony is helpful, as it helps you colonize those provinces without the need for hiring a conquistador. On one hand, the negative AE was great, but I think this would work out for colonizers better. Expansion naval policy. It was 50% transport compatibility and 10% tariffs, and now it's minus 20% state maintenance and minus 0.02% liberty desire from subject development. So this is definitely a buff. Say you're playing tall and you have multiple colonies, and then you took naval ideas to buff up your navy. The liberty desire from subject development is pretty good in that case, and the minus 20% state maintenance might not seem like much, but it adds up late game. A decent policy overall, and a good attempt by devs to boost the navy idea group. Expansion plutocratic policy changed from plus 5 settler chance and 10% tariffs to 10% production efficiency and 10% manpower. This policy also changed from diplo to admin group. The extra money and manpower is nice, but I don't see myself using this policy, especially when it costs an admin slot. Next is admin espionage policy, which was 10% goods produced and plus 20% spy defense. Now it's minus 0.1 corruption and 20% spy defense. The corruption reduction is nice with the new changes, but I would have preferred to keep the earlier policy, as goods produced modifier is the strongest economic modifier in game. Either way, I don't see myself using it often. Admin influence policy was minus 20% diplo annex cost, and now it's plus 0.5 prestige and plus 100% vassal force limit contribution. So clearly, the devs want to discourage vassal integration and promote having more vassals. The force limit contribution is pretty significant, and that would synergize well with the merc cost reductions in admin idea group, as you can afford to fill out that extra force limit. I will definitely miss the reduced diplo annex cost because I used to use it a lot, and I might not use this policy as often anymore. By the way, name of the policy is still Vassal Integration Act, which is not true anymore. Administrative naval policy was 10% trade efficiency and 20% ship repair, and now minus 20% institution embracement and minus 5% ship build speed. So institution embracement cost is okay, I mean it's just some ducats, and you could turn this policy on when you're trying to embrace institution, but then you're stuck with it for 10 years, and ship build speed is not very useful. This is one policy that no one's going to use, and it actually seems like a nerf. Administrative aristocratic policy was 20% improved relations minus 10% AE, and now it's plus 1 legitimacy, 0.1 RT, plus 1 devotion, plus 1 horde unity, or 0.5 meritocracy. Okay, so it seems that admin idea group policies have received a significant nerf. With admin policy, you're supposed to expand faster, which leads to AE, and earlier policy helped counter AE pretty well. So it's definitely a nerf for most countries. The 0.1 RT is good for republics, but how do you get aristocratic policy as a republic? You'll have to switch to republic later in game using government reforms. It seems very specific, and I don't see players using this policy very often. Humanist trade policy was minus 10% idea cost and plus 10% institution spread. Now it's minus 10% idea cost and plus 20% institution spread. So it's a good buff. As I mentioned in my Dharma pre-release video, the devs are giving us options to increase institution spread. Although it's not a very strong modifier, it still helps. Humanist maritime policy, it was minus 50% naval attrition, and now it's 10% tax and minus 33% morale on ship sinking. And this policy changed from diplo to admin. So this is a major buff for the policy and hopefully to maritime ideas, which is not used very often. The minus 33% morale on ship sinking will help naval battles a lot, and this is definitely one for naval-centric nations. Next, let's look at some of the diplomatic policies that were changed in the new patch. Espionage offensive policy. This policy changed from military to diplo. It's still a fairly weak policy and doesn't really increase the appeal for espionage ideas. The diplomatic plutocratic policy is changed from plus 1 diplo rep and 25% improved relations to minus 10% re-election cost, plus 1 legitimacy, devotion, horde unity, meritocracy, and it allows female generals, and there's a 25% plus chance of female advisors. So the diplo rep and improved relations was really great, and I'm sad to see it go. The re-election cost is good, and allowing female generals is a good idea for roleplay purposes. I mean, you are a republic, so you're supposed to be more progressive. That seems what the devs were going for here. But pure gameplay wise, it's a definite nerf to the earlier policy. Diplomatic quality policy, it was plus 1 diplo rep, minus 25% envoy travel time, and now it's plus 1 diplo rep and 0.05 war exhaustion reduction. This is definitely a buff. I would take war exhaustion reduction or envoy travel time any day. I believe people will use this policy more often now. Diplomatic naval policy changed from minus 10% AE and 20% improved relations to 33% ship capture chance. This one might not seem like a good change, but in my opinion, it's a buff. It will incentivize players to go for naval ideas with some countries when you're not looking to blob. The 33% ship capture chance is good, and when combined with the ship boarding doctrine, it's literally free navy. I know I'm taking naval ideas with Portugal next time. Diplo admin policy changed from plus 1 diplomat and minus 25% envoy travel time to minus 15% merc maintenance. And this policy changed from admin group to diplo group. This is a huge buff. The change from admin to diplo points is great, and the minus 15% merc maintenance goes well with the admin influence policy, which gives you more force limit from vassals. Now you can get those cheap mercs and blob and have big vassals who will give you more force limit, which means more blobbing. It's great. The diplo defensive policy changed from plus 25% hostile core creation cost and plus 1 diplo rep to plus 1 diplomat and plus 1 diplo rep. And it also changed from military to diplo group. The plus 1 diplomat is good, but late game my diplo points are used up in integrating vassals usually, and I have more military points, so overall I think it balanced out. Trade aristocratic policy was plus 15% trade power abroad and plus 1 merchant. Now it's plus 30% trade power abroad and plus 1 merchant. So it's a pretty straightforward buff. Trade naval policy was plus 15% trade power abroad and plus 10% trade efficiency. Now it's 40% ship trade power and minus 10% ship cost. So this one is a little hard to figure out. The trade mechanic is so complicated and affected by other countries' trade power that this policy change is difficult to measure. If I would have to take a guess, I think it's a slight buff. Exploration expansion policy changed from plus 20 settlers to plus 20 settlers and minus 50% native pricing. This is a huge buff for colonizers. Now you can use the native trading policy in your native policies. So there will be no pricing, and the extra production with the native assimilation is huge. Definitely a must-have for colonization games. Exploration religious policy changed from plus 20% religious unity and 10% tariffs to 10% tariffs and minus 0.1% liberty desire from development and subjects. This is another good buff to colonizers. The liberty desire reduction is significant, and again, the 20% religious unity was good, but it didn't make much sense with the religious idea group in a roleplay sense. This policy will be great for Portugal too, because as Portugal you take religious ideas for converting land in North Africa, and you can use this policy late game to keep your subjects in check. Exploration humanist policy was plus 10 settlers, plus 1 tolerance of heathens. Now it's plus 10 settlers and plus 50% native assimilation. This is also a big buff. You already get tolerance for heathens with humanists, and getting that extra native assimilation will help with good produce modifier, which is great. You can combine this policy with the exploration expansion policy, and you will see some significant improvement in your income. Exploration naval policy changed from plus 20% colonial range, 20% trade range to 20% naval combat engagement. This is a huge buff. The colonial range modifier was only useful for early years. Same goes for trade range modifier as well. And the 20% naval combat engagement basically gives you 20% more damage with your navy. Another good reason to take naval idea groups. On the flip side, late game AI England Navy is going to be even more difficult to deal. Exploration offensive policy changed from military group to diplo group. Not sure if it's a nerf or a buff, and we will see how this change turns out mid to late game in the new patch. Maritime offensive policy changed from plus 10% trade efficiency plus 5% ship durability to plus 1 naval maneuver and plus 5% ship durability. That is pretty good. The naval maneuver for admirals increases your navy's speed and helps with naval engagement too. And you won't really miss that 10% trade efficiency, as higher naval maneuver also means better ship trade power. So you say you take this policy and you already have the plus 2 maneuver from maritime ideas. This means you have plus 3 maneuver admiral guaranteed, which is pretty good. Maritime defensive policy changed from minus 10% ship cost, minus 10% ship cost, and plus 15% naval force limit. This is a straight up buff, more boats are good. Maritime naval policy changed from plus 50% blockade and plus 15% naval force limit to plus 50% blockade and plus 50% privateering. This also changed from military group to diplo group. So this is a mixed bag. You lose the force limit, but the 50% privateering is pretty strong. Influence humanist policy changed from plus 20% improved relations and plus 1 diplo rep to plus 1 relations and plus 1 diplo rep. So this policy is again geared towards having more vassals rather than going full expansionist, as the improved relations modifier helped with AE. It's neither a buff or a nerf for me, it's just encouraging players to play a bit differently. Now let's see some of the military policies that were changed. The aristocratic diplomatic policy changed from plus 1 legitimacy, devotion, horde unity, meritocracy, RT to plus 1 diplomat and plus 1 free reader. This policy was weak to begin with, and I think it has gone weaker. I would not recommend taking this policy at any time. Aristocratic exploration policy changed from plus 1 diplomat and plus 1 diplo rep to 33% manpower. It also changed from diplo group to military group. The extra diplo rep was nice in this policy, but 33% manpower is pretty significant too. Though I am hard pressed to think where I might take aristocratic and exploration ideas in the same game. Plutocratic espionage policy changed from minus 1 unrest, 20% spy defense to 33% manpower, and it switched from admin to military group. Switching from admin to military is nice, and again, the extra manpower is nice if you take the espionage ideas. Plutocratic influence policy changed from minus 1 unrest and minus 1 diplo annex cost to 100% vassal force limit modifier. It also changed from diplo to military group. And another diplo annex cost modifier gone. And yet again more incentive to have more vassals rather than integrate them. Overall, I think it's a great buff for merchant republics and will definitely help with few achievement runs. Bureaucratic trade policy changed from plus 30% trade power abroad to plus 1 merchant and minus 10% regiment costs. This also changed from the Diplo group to military group. More merchants are good, and late game if you have spare military points, you can convert them to money with this policy. I think it's a slight buff to the older one, and it's definitely worth a consideration if you're playing as merchant republic. Offensive trade policy changed from 25% embargo, 10% trade efficiency to 10% move speed and 10% trade efficiency. I personally like this. The movement speed modifier is fairly rare and it's pretty useful. I would definitely consider this a buff. Offensive influence policy changed from minus 0.1% liberty desire and 100% vassal force limit contribution to minus 20% reinforced cost and plus 1 diplo rep. I am on the fence on this one. On one hand, the liberty desire and force limit modifiers synergized well with influence ideas. On the other hand, minus 20% reinforced cost will save you a lot, and the extra diplo relation is always nice. Quality admin policy changed from 10% morale speed to 15% morale speed and 15% reinforced speed. Good buff, although I don't see myself taking this policy anytime soon. Quality espionage policy. This policy changed from admin to military group, so this is definitely a buff. This policy might come in use if someone takes espionage ideas. Quality economic policy also changed from admin group to military group, and it's still pretty good. Now it uses military points, so it might actually be a bit better. Quantity espionage changed from plus 25% available mercs and minus 25% merc maintenance to 25% available mercs and minus 15% merc maintenance. So this is a straightforward nerf. I don't know why this was done, but you don't question the whim of paradox gods. Quantity admin policy was minus 5% land maintenance and plus 10% manpower recovery, and now it's plus 15% manpower recovery. So this is a straight up buff. This has always been a good policy early to mid game, and the slight buff is very welcome. Naval espionage policy changed from plus 5% naval morale recovery and 10% light ship compatibility to 10% naval engagement and plus 1 blockage impact on siege. Another good buff to naval ideas where you have naval supremacy. And that was all the policy changes in 1.26 Dharma patch and DLC. As you can tell, it's fairly significant and it will have an effect on gameplay. And since now you can choose 3 free policies, it will be important to take these policies into consideration when selecting the first couple of idea groups. The admin idea policies got nerfed hard, while less used idea groups such as naval and maritime have some good policies now, which should see them used more often. Espionage still looks very weak though. Moreover, looking at all the policy changes along with changes in 1.26 patch, it definitely seems like the devs want the players to play a more vassal-centric game, rather than take provinces for themselves and go full expansionist. The colonizers and merchant republics also got major buff with policies. Although I think blobbing is still the best way to expand, the new patch and DLC just released, and it remains to be seen if someone can devise a better strategy for late game expansion. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.